Welcome to Charts Today. My name's David Linton, and today's edition for Monday, the 14th of January 2019, comes to you from Nairobi in Kenya. I've actually been away for 2 weeks. I'm back in London tomorrow. But we start by looking at the markets. My first proper look in the new year, and we see here the dollar has actually been sinking the last few weeks. Since mid-December, we've come off quite a bit on the dollar. We see here we're on the short-term chart just starting to move into bullish territory, but we do have these downside targets hanging over us. We're hitting quite solid resistance here on the point and figure chart as well, and we're seeing on the weekly chart that lagging line being dragged down. We are long-term heading into positive territory though, so it's still a bit early to call the turn in the dollar from looking more and more bullish. We see against the euro dollar actually just finding a little bit of support, but not really trading on that weaker dollar much higher. We're still bearish in the short and medium term charts. This is the 60-minute chart. Remembering this is my weekly and 1%, my long-term view, my medium-term view daily and 0.5%, and my short-term view, the 60-minute chart, with the 0.1% point figure chart on 60-minute data. This data all coming from Thomson Reuters Icon. If you're a private user, Metastock Zenith. Looking at the Japanese yen, we see here the dollar just sinking lower. So we have seen the dollar really falling away against that stronger yen. Sterling has actually been quite strong against that weaker dollar over the last few days. We're still long-term bearish and medium-term bearish on the charts. We've got lots of downside targets still hanging over us. Of course, a lot centering around Brexit and the vote this week. We're seeing here sterling did jump against the euro on Friday. So we are actually in short-term bullish territory, but medium and long-term we're still bearish. Against the Swiss franc, sterling also looking a little bit higher at 126. But again, we've really over the last few months, in the context, we've fallen from the low 130s to the mid 120s, so we are just seeing that through. And the Aussie dollar, sterling actually looking a little bit stronger here on the weaker dollar. Both the Aussie and New Zealand dollars hit overnight with weaker data from China, which we'll look at in a minute. Bitcoin sitting at $3,500, still bearish on all three time frames, so no new year run there. US markets on Friday were down slightly. We're seeing the recovery that we've had in the last few weeks on the US markets. We see that on the weekly chart here showing through three solid candles. But of course, that move is at the moment to a lower high. So we're seeing in terms of the trend, we've got to move quite a long way to break into bullish territory. We are short-term bullish. We've got upside targets of around 4%. But the medium and long-term charts are still bearish. The markets have got off to a good start this year, but it's too early to say we're in full recovery mode. And here we see the Nasdaq 100 with a very similar picture. We do have upside targets, thrust targets of around 10% on the recovery. We have downside targets of around 17%. So the market is liable to go either way, and it's really hard to call. The key thing is it's not a dead cert that this is a recovery. We're seeing the Dow Jones index also similarly bullish in the short term, has bounced on the lagging line, so looking a little bit better there, but no clear upside targets here on the long-term chart, 10% upside on the medium-term chart. And the Russell 2000 index, again, we've got about 6% upside on that 0.5% chart, and 8% and 2% upside target. So there is possible recovery, but don't be surprised to see the market lurching to make new lows again. We are on a bearish trend. The future this morning, we're seeing the S&P 500 future down 0.75%, and the Nasdaq E-mini is down over 1%. The market is actually pricing in falls in the US market today, so 1% on tech stocks. The FTSE 100, we're not yet open in the UK. We've got just under an hour to go to the open. Is down 0.5% on the future. So we're expecting prices to open lower, and the Xetra DAX future down 0.75%, heading lower there as well. Looking at the actual cash market, we see the FTSE 100 short-term recovery, but still medium and long-term bearish. So whilst we've got some upside potential, no clear downside targets. Of course, it's all about the US markets and how the UK market will follow and react. Looking at the 250, we've seen recovery here as well, but still in bearish territory on the medium and long-term charts. The same with the DAX. We're seeing here medium-term and long-term bearish, and the CAC 40 fared better than most markets last year, but in Europe, but still looking pretty bearish as well. Looking at Japanese yen, sorry, the Japanese market, we're seeing we're bearish here too, and the Hang Seng had a fall of 1.5% overnight. We'll look at the individual stocks shortly, but that is clearly in bearish territory with a downside target of about 11%. Last year, the big moves were in China, and we're still bearish on all three time frames. We've got these really big targets hanging over us in China, and they have been activated. This is the chart that probably worries me the most at the moment, is the Chinese stock market liable to collapse. We've activated this new downside target, 22% lower. We've got lots of downside targets to play for here. It's hard to be bullish about China on the chart. Looking at the Sensex, we see here we're bearish as well. The long-term chart holding on to a bullish trend, but the short-term and medium-term charts just turning bearish as well. Global sentiment still a little bit concerning, and the Aussie market looking good short-term, but medium and long-term still bearish. Brent crude has had a bit of a recovery over the last few weeks. We see that in the daily chart and the weekly chart, but we're just starting to turn over. This is the time of year, though, we do expect to see a strong showing of Brent. It normally goes up in the first half of the year for crude oil, so we would expect to see quite a strong quarter, but at the moment just looking like we're coming off the top there, and we've got a downside target of 3.6% on the short-term chart, 4% on WTI, and we are just entering bearish territory here on the short-term chart, so just looking a little bit more bearish. US nat gas jumped 6% overnight, so we are seeing quite strong moves here back to $3.30. We had a lot of gyrations at the end of last year, and it'll be interesting to see where we go next with no clear targets there on the charts. Keep an eye on the 1-minute chart if you're trading nat gas, and products like heating oil following crude as we might expect. Gold is looking pretty strong still, sitting in the 1290s level. Just can't get quite through that $1,300 mark. We've tested it this year, but not able to get through yet. But we're starting to look more and more bullish on the long-term chart. We've got these upside targets here. We'll have a new thrust target on this column when we see a reversal. So it just needs to break 1350 and gold will be breaking out. So still looking pretty good. Silver also looking bullish on the medium-term chart. Long-term has more work to do than gold. US 10-year yields sitting at 2.7%, reflecting the change in sentiment that we saw in the last few months of the year last year, where we went from the high around the 320s now down to 270. So we've seen about a 0.5% fall, with the Fed announcing that they'll probably raise rates more slowly, and the German bonds we're seeing recover in the bond market as a result of those lower yields. Looking at the tech majors, just Apple, I look at the 60-minute charts here, which you don't get on Yahoo data, and we see here we're just starting to emerge into positive territory on the short-term chart, but we still are bearish medium term. Maybe we'll find support in the lagging line here long term. We just need to keep an eye out. We have got some still pretty scary downside targets on the short-term chart, down 3.7%. The long-term chart, the targets are a bit exhausted there. Looking at Alphabet, we are actually bullish short term again, and we have held the long term trend better than most. Facebook has had a dire year last year, seen a bit of a recovery into the 140s in the new year, and we do have upside potential of 4 and 6% on the charts, but these big downside targets still hang over us. And Amazon actually recovering into bullish territory short term, and again holding its bull trend long term, so looking better than most stocks. Taking a look at the individual stocks, first of all we will take a look at the Nasdaq 100. Just looking at the majors here, this is the Dow Jones relative, so we're just seeing here relative to Dow Jones we went from 30% outperformance to around 9% underperformance. So Apple has really had a pretty tough year last year, and still looking a bit worrying for the market. The lack of clear downside targets is our only real hope for Apple. Looking at Facebook, we were down on Friday, and we see here that the relative chart, we're down 18% against the Dow last year, so really quite key there. We see we did have a mixed picture on Friday with a lot of stocks up on the Nasdaq. We saw Microsoft actually down, but still holding on to their relative performance, and that long-term bull trend is still looking pretty good on Microsoft. Netflix were up substantially, up 4% on Friday, so they're looking stronger, about to recover into bullish territory on the short-term chart, and we're seeing the relative about 70% outperformance. At one stage, it had doubled. It was double the performance that we'd seen in the index of the Dow. Came all the way back to 25%, and we've had a really sharp re-rating of Netflix over the last few weeks. So that's been quite key as well. Taking a look at Tesla, we see here Tesla also still holding its relatively good, strong position, although very choppy price behavior. Looking at the world indices, we see a sea of red. Asia, we see here really heavily down. Most markets in Asia quite heavily down. Looking at the Aussie market, just looking at the best performers, they had Investor Office Fund, that was up 5%, so looking reasonable there. 7 West Media also up, but actually the chart's still looking pretty dire. 9 Entertainment Group also up, but the chart again looking pretty dire. Turn to the other side of the market, looking at the bearish end. BlueScope down 5%. Seeing a lot of stocks still looking terrible on the charts. Really quite clear downtrends here. Whitehaven Coal in bearish trend on that medium-term chart. Looking to China, handful of stocks are up in China, but if we look at the other end of the market, we see here quite a lot that was down, around 2%, 2.8. So that was enough to pull the index lower. And the Hang Seng, we only had 4 stocks up, so really quite key. Up 0.5% on Bank Communications Limited. That stock looking better than most, as we can see here in the relative chart. And if we go to the other end of the market, we see here stocks down as much as 4%. Galaxy Entertainment, CNO as well. Moving to the Indian market, again a handful of stocks up. Just ranking by percentage. Yes Bank had a terrible year last year, really collapsing in the last few months of the year. Infosys actually still holding on to its bull trend, so looking much better there. These prices are coming in live from Yahoo Finance, of course, into Updata. And here we see Gale India Limited also looking lower. Wipro holding on there, but down some 3%. And the Nikkei 225, we had quite a mixed picture in the Nikkei 225. So we are seeing, we saw Olympus, for example, up 9%, Hitachi up 8%. So some quite big moves, although a lot of these charts still look pretty bearish. Taking a look at the European market, and I say we're about to open in about 3/4 of an hour. Looking at the FTSE 100 first. And just looking at Friday's performance, we had Taylor Wimpey. House builders actually up quite sharply on Friday. We had Taylor Wimpey, Persimmon, Barratt Developments. Don't be surprised to see these stocks giving back with this Brexit vote. It'll be quite interesting to see house prices and how they react to that. International Consolidated Airlines, old British Airways as was, actually looking still pretty bearish, although that was up 2.5%. EasyJet we saw was up 2%, and Centrica was up 1% on Friday, 1.8%. On the downside, we had NMC Health down 5%, Smurfit Kappa down 4.5%, and AstraZeneca down a massive 3.5%. Melrose Industries down 3.3%. So we are still seeing some pretty big performances to the downside. In the 250 in the UK market, Stobbart Group were up, made their bid for Flybe, of course, with Virgin. That's looking like a pretty grim share price, and the relative performance underperforming the market by 40% last year. Very susceptible to Brexit, of course, but we are seeing a big move there on Friday. It'll be interesting to see whether they can actually reverse their trend. A lot of work to do that. Euro Money up 5%, looking better than most stocks as well. Hunting Group up 5%. Looking at the downside, we saw UDC Healthcare down 7%. Really has underperformed badly. Thomas Cook, their woes don't end anywhere. They're still looking lower. Hastings Group down as well. Taking a look at the Euro Stock 600, we saw here Kindred Group as up 5%, Hella up 5%. So we did see some pretty good performances on Friday, Taylor Wimpey, Persimmon, Money Supermarket, quite a lot of the London stocks here in the performance stakes. On the downside on Friday, we still do have some quite big performers to the downside. So it's a case of where we're seeing that performance. And if we look at that, we see again Valeo in France just falling lower here. It's been nothing but finding the bottom. So it's an interesting start to the year, but really the picture hasn't changed. We're seeing a little bit of a recovery, but the markets are still looking pretty bearish in their medium and long-term charts. It's going to take a lot more to convince us from a chart perspective that we're going to see a recovery. Keep an eye out on those US indices for any signs of a lower low. And of course, we are expecting, based on the futures, we're seeing the NASDAQ down 1% at the open today. That's it for today. Until tomorrow in London, happy charting. See you then.